The last thing I remember clearly, before the drug pulled me under, was the sound of my own daughter's signature drying on a piece of paper that would erase me from my own life. Two men in pale blue scrubs already had my arms pinned before the ink had even set. And the man who orchestrated it all, the man wearing my daughter's wedding ring on his hand, and my company's future folded up neatly in his jacket pocket, leaned down close enough that only I could hear him. He told me I would rot in that padded room until I died, and that everyone, in the end, would win. My name is Augustine Crane. I am 72 years old. 6 months before that night, I was nothing more than an old man in a gray suit that smelled faintly of mothballs, standing at the edge of a party I had personally paid for, feeling like a stranger nobody had thought to invite. If you're watching this, tell me in the comments, has your own family ever looked at you and seen nothing but a burden to be managed? Stay until the end, because the man who thought he had buried me alive had absolutely no idea he was standing on top of a trap I had built 20 years before he ever said my daughter's name. If this story moves you even a little, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight. Now let me take you back to the party where all of it began. I have built bridges that hold entire highways, steady during earthquakes. My name sits quietly on patents inside this country's fighter jets and its aircraft carriers, the kind of work that never makes headlines because it's only ever noticed when it fails. On paper, I am worth more than the gross domestic product of a few small nations put together. And on the night of my daughter's 5th wedding anniversary, I stood at the edge of a rented Hamptons estate in a suit I had owned since the Clinton administration, holding a glass of ice water because I don't drink at other men's parties, feeling like a janitor who had wandered in through the wrong door and forgotten how to find his way back out. The suit was steel gray, the wool worn thin at both elbows, the kind of gray that has long since stopped apologizing for itself. I drove out from the city alone in my old Ford F-150, the one with 190,000 miles on the odometer and a check engine light that had been glowing steadily since Obama's 2nd term. I parked it myself, well past the long row of valets, wedged between 2 Bentleys, worth more combined than the entire lineage of that truck stretching back 3 generations. I didn't need a stranger half my age to park my own vehicle for me. I built everything I own with these 2 hands, loading cargo trucks in freezing rain for years before I ever signed a single payroll check. And some habits don't retire simply because the bank balance eventually did the opposite. My daughter Isabel looked radiant that night, wrapped in a dress that likely cost more than the down payment on my very first house, back when Isabel's mother and I were counting nickels on a kitchen table in a rented apartment above a hardware store. Isabel runs an art gallery in the city now, has an eye for talent I like to believe she inherited from her mother, along with the same soft laugh and the same stubborn tilt of the chin when she's decided not to back down. But even from across that crowded room, I could see the tension sitting behind her eyes, the careful way she kept glancing toward her husband every few minutes, the way a person checks the sky before deciding whether it's still safe to walk outside without an umbrella close at hand. Her husband's name is Dorian Steed, 35 years old, a portfolio manager on Wall Street with a smile built for cameras and a mustard yellow pocket square he wore that night, like a flag of allegiance to a country called himself. I watched him work that ballroom, the way a magician works a stage, a hand resting on an elbow. Here, a laugh half a second too loud there, always making certain that every person of consequence in that room understood he belonged fully to their tribe, and not, under any circumstance, to mine. What none of them knew that evening was that I'd already spent 8 quiet months investigating the son-in-law my daughter had married in something of a hurry, because a man's lifestyle should generally match his salary, and Dorian's numbers had never once managed the arithmetic. There was the penthouse near the park, leased under a name that wasn't quite his own. The Aston Martin he'd financed through a shell company registered in Delaware. The $200,000 wedding he'd thrown for my only child, paid for. I would later confirm through my own investigator, almost entirely on credit lines, he had no real intention of ever fully repaying. Real rainmakers exist on Wall Street, plenty of them. They rarely need 3 separate revolving lines of debt just to keep the lights on in a life that exists mainly for an audience. He waved me over that night the way a man summons a waiter he's already decided in advance to undertip. "Come here, Reggie. Sorry, Augustine," he called out, laughing loudly at his own slip of the tongue, before I'd even fully crossed the room, in front of a group that included his boss, a man named Warfield Cross, the CEO of the fund Dorian answered to, and I suspected, quietly feared in roughly equal measure. I walked over slowly, unhurried. My knees ached with every step across that polished marble floor. 40 years of loading trucks in the rain, finally collecting on a debt that time never truly forgives. Dorian threw a heavy arm around my shoulder the way a man drapes an arm across livestock. He's about to walk into an auction ring. "Everyone, this is my father-in-law," he announced, his voice carrying easily 3 tables in every direction. A real man of the people. Drives a truck out there that sounds like a lawnmower having a heart attack in the valet line. We try to help him out where we can. Throw him a bone here and there, you understand? Honestly, though, he's a bit of a fossil. The silence of the Stone Age, walking around in a suit that's probably older than half the people standing at this table. A ripple of laughter moved through the group, the nervous kind people give when they aren't entirely sure whether it's safe to laugh yet. My daughter looked down at the floor, studying the toe of her own shoe with sudden, intense interest. She did not say a single word in my defense. She let her husband hollow her father out into a punchline for the momentary approval of men who would not remember Dorian's name in 10 years' time, let alone mine. Something ignited quietly in my chest that night, but it was not the fury you might expect from a man like me. It was clarity, cold, patient, and complete. I did not build an empire by losing my composure in rented ballrooms. I built it by remaining patient long after other men had exhausted every ounce of their own patience, and I was not about to break 40 years of discipline over a boy in a rented tuxedo who thought a mustard-yellow pocket square constituted a personality. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't correct him in front of his boss and embarrass my daughter further. I simply thanked her for a lovely evening, excused myself with a small nod toward the room, and walked toward the side terrace and the cool night air waiting beyond the glass doors. But before I left that ballroom entirely, I did one thing I had planned for weeks in advance, down to the exact minute. I set an old, cracked leather briefcase down on the arm of a sofa near the bar. The same briefcase I had once carried into board meetings 30 years earlier, back when men still respected a firm handshake more than a flashy suit, and I walked out of that party without it. I knew Dorian well by then, better than he ever suspected I did. I knew a man like him cannot walk past an unattended object that might belong to someone he considers beneath him, because contempt makes people curious in a way that respect almost never manages to. I knew, with near total certainty, that he would open that briefcase before the night was fully over. He did at midnight, alone in the guest bedroom of that rented estate, long after the last guests had finally gone home and my daughter had exhausted herself into sleep beside him. Inside the briefcase sat a single external hard drive, wrapped in a plain, manila envelope that had clearly been meant to look forgotten. On it, detailed bank statements from an account registered in the Cayman Islands showing a running balance of $500 million, alongside a carefully constructed trail of forged internal emails suggesting that I, Augustine Crane, had spent years quietly hiding that entire fortune from the Internal Revenue Service under a series of shell entities. I know precisely what his face looked like in that moment, because I designed every single document on that drive myself, months in advance, down to the letterhead and the typographical errors a real IRS filing would never contain. I have imagined his expression more times than I care to admit, since the greed lighting up behind his eyes like a slot machine finally paying out after years of feeding it quarters he couldn't afford. He believed, in that private, self-congratulating moment, sitting alone on the edge of a stranger's guest bed, that he had finally discovered my one true weakness. He believed, with the full confidence of a man who has never once been genuinely tested, that he had found the leash he could slip around my neck at last. He had no idea whatsoever that he was holding a leash I had built specifically for him, 1 full year earlier, with the quiet, careful cooperation of 2 federal agents who had been waiting a very long time for a man exactly like Dorian Steed to reach for it with both hands. 3 days after the anniversary party, Dorian arrived at my Manhattan townhouse without the basic courtesy of a phone call first. He walked into my study carrying that hard drive the way a man carries a loaded weapon into a room he intends to win. And in every way that mattered, that's exactly what it was to him, aimed squarely at what he believed was my throat. "I know what you've been hiding, Augustine," he said, dropping uninvited into the leather chair across from my desk, not bothering to remove his overcoat, as though he didn't intend to stay long enough for it to matter. "Cayman accounts. Fake losses reported to the IRS for years. $500 million sitting offshore while the rest of us are out here actually struggling to make rent every month." He set the drive down between us on the desk like a man laying down a winning hand of cards he was absolutely certain no one at the table could beat. "Here's how this works now. You're going to sign over power of attorney to me. Let me manage the estate quietly, clean it all up, before I have no choice but to hand a copy of this to the FBI myself. I want you to understand something about me because it will matter for everything that follows in this story. I have negotiated across conference tables from men who tried to bankrupt entire cities for sport and slept perfectly well afterward. I have sat calmly through meetings with attorneys whose only assignment that day was to make me flinch first. I do not flinch. I have never flinched, not once in 50 years of business, not even the day the doctors told me about my wife Margaret's diagnosis in a room that smelled of hand sanitizer and bad coffee. But that afternoon, sitting across from my own son-in-law in the study where I raised my daughter, I let my hand tremble on purpose. I let the teacup resting on my desk slip from my fingers and shatter loudly against the hardwood floor. I pressed both palms to my temples and muttered something incoherent about men in dark cars parked outside my windows at night, about numbers that no longer added up the way they used to in my head, about being so tired, so terribly and completely tired of it all. Dorian leaned forward when he saw that, and I watched something shift behind his own eyes. Not sympathy, never sympathy, but the quiet, professional satisfaction of a predator confirming that the wounded animal in front of him was, in fact, wounded exactly where he needed it to be. He didn't reach out to steady me. He didn't offer to pick up the shattered pieces of the teacup scattered across my study floor. He simply watched, cataloging, filing away every trembling detail for later use, the way a man photographs evidence he intends to present in a courtroom of his own choosing. When he finally rose to leave, he paused at the study door and said almost gently, as if he believed the kindness in his own voice, "Get some rest, Augustine. We'll take care of everything from here. I have thought many times since about how a threat can be dressed so carefully in the language of tenderness that even the man delivering it seems to believe his own performance. I handed Dorian Steed exactly what his greed had been starving for since the moment he opened that briefcase, the image of a frightened, failing old man who might do something reckless if he felt cornered by the very institutions meant to protect him. A man who was, perhaps, no longer entirely fit to manage his own affairs, let alone a fortune the size of the one sitting on that hard drive between us. He left my study that day wearing the exact expression of a poker player convinced he had just cleared the entire table without breaking a sweat. That evening, as the sun dropped low over the skyline and painted the windows of my daughter's apartment a deep burnt orange, a color I would come to associate with betrayal for the rest of my natural life, the way certain smells never fully leave a person. Dorian sat down beside Isabel on their sofa and began gently and with tremendous patience to lie to her. I was not in that room. I did not need to be. My daughter told me every word of it herself months later, sitting across from me at this very desk, through tears that seemed to rise up from somewhere so deep inside her chest that I don't believe she had touched that particular place in years, not since she was small enough to still believe her father could fix anything that broke. He told her I was unraveling, slowly and dangerously, right in front of everyone who loved me. He told her that in my study 3 days earlier I'd grabbed his wrist without warning and ranted for nearly an hour about federal agents watching my house from unmarked cars parked along the street. He told her he had found several cans of kerosene stacked carefully in my garage, that I had whispered to him about burning down my own home before they could ever come and take it from me first. He told her that a psychiatrist friend of his, a man he claimed to trust completely with his own family's health, had listened patiently to his account of my behavior over dinner and used a single word that would go on to detonate quietly, again and again, inside my daughter's chest for the following several weeks. Dementia. "We can't let him keep living like this, Isabel," he told her, his voice thick with a tenderness I now know was entirely rehearsed in front of a bathroom mirror. "He isn't safe anymore, honey, and if I'm being completely honest, he isn't safe to be around either. If we don't act soon, if we don't get guardianship properly in place before this gets worse, he could hurt himself badly. He could hurt someone else without ever meaning a moment of it. I know this feels wrong in your gut. I know every single part of you wants to fight me on this right now. But sometimes love looks exactly like this, Isabel, taking the wheel gently from someone who can no longer see the road clearly in front of them." Isabel told me she cried for nearly 2 hours that night, curled against Dorian's chest while he stroked her hair and murmured that everything would be all right, once we took care of it, once we made sure Daddy was somewhere safe where trained professionals could watch over him around the clock. She told me she remembers thinking, even through the fog of her own grief, that something about the word we felt wrong in a way she couldn't name, as though Dorian had already decided, long before that conversation, exactly how this particular story was going to end for both of us. She said she almost called me that night, almost drove straight to my house at 2 a.m. to ask me herself, and that Dorian gently talked her out of it, telling her the shock of a confrontation might send me spiraling further, that it was kinder, safer, to let the professionals handle it quietly instead. He never once showed her the real hard drive sitting in his own desk drawer. He never let her see the actual numbers, the actual fabricated accusation buried inside those forged files I myself had written. He simply took the purest, oldest love my daughter had ever carried in her entire life, her love for her father, and turned it, patiently and skillfully, into the precise instrument he needed to lock that same father away from her for good. I have come to believe, with absolute certainty across the years since that particular night, that gaslighting rarely works on foolish people. It works almost exclusively and almost perfectly on people who love too completely to ever imagine that the person closest to them in the entire world could look them dead in the eye and lie without so much as a single flicker crossing their face. My daughter was never weak, not for one day of her life. She was simply loved, or believed with her whole heart that she was loved, by a man who understood precisely that her devotion was the softest and most exploitable part of her, and he went for it the way a trained surgeon reaches for an artery he already knows the exact location of before he ever picks up the scalpel. Isabel came to my study exactly 1 week later, a manila folder pressed flat against her chest like a shield made of paper, her eyes swollen and red from what I could tell had been several sleepless nights in a row, each one worse than the last. I had known this particular moment was coming from the first night I set that briefcase down on a stranger's sofa. In a very real sense, I had built the exact road that led her straight to my study door that gray afternoon. Knowing that in advance did not make it any easier to sit still in my own chair and watch her walk every step of it toward me. Her shoulders curved inward, the way they used to when she was 7 years old and had to confess to breaking something she loved. "Daddy," she said, and her voice cracked cleanly in half on the second syllable, "I need you to sign something for me, please." She set the folder down on my desk with hands that would not stop trembling, no matter how tightly she pressed them flat against the wood. Inside was a formal petition for medical and financial conservatorship, a dense legal document requesting that a family court judge strip me of the right to manage my own money, my own medical decisions, my own remaining years of freedom, and hand every ounce of that authority directly and completely to Dorian Steed. I read through all 14 pages of it slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch long enough that I watched Isabel's composure begin to crack around the edges, her fingers twisting the strap of her purse into a tight, nervous knot. "It's for your own good," she whispered, and I watched my own daughter believe, with her entire aching heart, every single word coming out of her own mouth in that moment. "You've been saying things that scare me, Dad." Dorian showed me. He explained everything to me, all of it. "I just want to keep you safe until we can figure this whole thing out together, the two of us. Please, please just sign it for me today." I looked up into her eyes for one long, unguarded second and let her see the real me sitting there, the sharpness that had once negotiated federal defense contracts worth billions and quietly outmaneuvered competitors twice Dorian's age before he was even born. It was there in my eyes and gone again in an instant, but I saw her flinch slightly, saw some small buried part of her recognize, just for the length of a single heartbeat, that the man sitting across the desk from her was not confused in the slightest. For one terrible moment, I almost told her everything right there. I almost reached across the desk and put both her hands in mine and said, "Her husband is lying to you, and I have the proof sitting in a drawer not 4 feet from where you're standing." But I had learned across a long and difficult life that a truth handed to someone too early, before they are ready to believe it over the voice of the person they sleep beside every night, simply bounces off and gets absorbed instead by the lie standing closer to them. She needed to see it herself, in her own time, with her own eyes. There was no other way through that would not cost me her forever. Then I let my eyes drift soft and distant once more, the way I had practiced alone in front of my own mirror for 3 straight nights, learning the exact angle of confusion a man wears when the floor of his own mind has started to give way beneath him. I let my hand shake as I lifted the pen from its holder on the desk, and I signed my own name away, one careful, deliberately trembling letter at a time, watching my daughter's shoulders sag with what she believed in that moment was relief, her breath leaving her in a long, shuddering exhale as though she had been holding it for a week. That very same afternoon, 2 orderlies in pale blue scrubs arrived at my front door, sent for in advance by Dorian, and I was led, not dragged. I want to be entirely and explicitly clear about that detail, because I did not resist them in any physical way whatsoever, since a struggle was precisely the story Dorian needed the rest of the world to believe about me from that day forward. Out to a waiting, unmarked van and driven 40 minutes north of the city to a private psychiatric facility called Fairhaven Rest, tucked quietly behind a stand of old pines that blocked most of it from the road, the kind of place you could drive past 100 times without ever quite noticing it was there. Dorian followed close behind in his own car, directly behind that van the entire way, and as mine pulled slowly away from the curb outside my own home, I watched him through the small rear window, straightening his mustard yellow pocket square in the reflection of his side mirror, wearing the exact smile of a man who genuinely believed he had just swallowed $500 million whole and was already, privately, savoring the taste of it on his tongue. Here is what Dorian Steed did not know yet, and what I want you, the person watching this video right now, to feel fully in this exact moment, the particular patient pleasure of watching a trap close slowly and completely around a man who built every single inch of it himself, out of nothing but his own bottomless greed. That hard drive, the Cayman account, the entire $500 million, every forged email suggesting I was hiding it from the IRS across a decade was never real money to begin with, because none of it was ever meant to be spent by anyone. A full year before that anniversary party ever took place, I had worked directly and quietly with 2 agents from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division to build what agents in that particular world call a honeypot, a decoy account dressed up perfectly, down to the last transaction record, to resemble the private fortune of a paranoid, tax-evading old man, wired from the very beginning with a single, silent trigger buried deep inside its architecture, where no ordinary auditor would ever think to look. Any attempt to access that account using a legal instrument of authority, a power of attorney, a conservatorship order, guardianship papers signed and sealed by a family court judge, would automatically freeze the account on the spot, alert federal investigators in real time, and generate a permanent, unbreakable digital trail identifying the exact person who had reached for it. This was not embezzlement in any ordinary, forgivable sense of the word. It was something far cleaner and far harder to argue away in front of a jury of 12 ordinary citizens. Federal financial fraud, committed under the very legal authority the person had fought so hard, so publicly, and so cruelly to obtain for themselves at another person's expense. Dorian Steed had not found my weakness hidden inside that old leather briefcase. He had found a signature quietly waiting there all along, patient as a held breath, for his own name to finally arrive and sign it. I want to tell you something about that ride north, because I think about it more than almost anything else from those months. I sat in the back of that van with my hands folded in my lap, watching the city thin out into highway, then into trees, and I did not feel afraid. I felt strangely closer to my late wife, Margaret, than I had in years, because it was Margaret who used to say that the people who love you the most are also the only ones capable of hurting you this badly, and that the trick of a long life was learning to forgive the second thing without ever excusing it. I did not know, riding in that van, exactly how long Isabel would need to see the truth for herself. I only knew that I had built the road carefully enough that she would eventually have to walk it, and that some part of being her father meant trusting her to walk it even when I could not walk it for her. 3 days into my stay at Fairhaven, in a corner office overlooking the East River, Dorian sat down at his laptop with the newly notarized guardianship document stacked neatly beside his keyboard, and the easy, untested confidence of a man who had never once, in his entire adult life, lost a fight he himself had started. He had debts, real ones, the kind that don't send strongly worded letters when a payment falls even a day late. Federal investigators would later place the total figure at just over $4 million, most of it owed to men who collect their money in ways that don't require a courtroom or a subpoena, accumulated across 3 years of a lifestyle that had always outpaced his actual salary by a wide and widening margin. Private card games in the back rooms of clubs that did not appear on any receipt, high-stakes bets placed through an offshore sportsbook, a taste for a kind of life that never once slowed down long enough to let him catch up on what it actually cost. He needed cash immediately, that same week if possible, and now, holding legal control over my entire estate on paper, he genuinely believed he had finally found a door wide enough for a man like him to walk straight through without ducking. He logged into the offshore account using the fresh credentials the guardianship order had granted him only days earlier. He navigated carefully to the balance, watching the number sit there patiently on the screen, $500 million glowing quietly in front of him like the answer to every problem he had ever created for himself. He entered a transfer of $50 million, routed toward an account he alone controlled through a contact in Zurich, intending to clear every last debt he owed in a single quiet afternoon and still walk away comfortably, permanently wealthy on top of it, with enough left over to disappear somewhere warm if the wedding scandal ever needed him to. He pressed enter, and for one full second, he told his own attorney later, he actually smiled, the way a man smiles when he believes the hardest part of his life is finally, mercifully behind him, and the rest of it is simply going to be spent enjoying the view. His screen went red. Not a gentle warning, not a patient spinning wheel of loading dots, a hard, saturated crimson that swallowed the entire display in an instant, with a single line of stark white text burned directly across the center. Account frozen. Federal investigation in progress. United States Department of Justice, Financial Crimes Division. I am told because two agents later described this exact moment to me in careful, almost clinical detail during a sworn deposition, that Dorian sat perfectly still in that leather office chair for nearly a full minute before he understood what he had actually just done to himself with a single click of his own mouse. He had not stolen quietly from a paranoid old man tucked safely away in a nursing facility 40 minutes outside the city. He had used a court order carrying his own legal name, his own signature, his own social security number, to attempt an unauthorized wire transfer out of an account already flagged, watched, and patiently waiting inside an active federal investigation. He was no longer chasing a fortune through the comfortable shadows he'd grown so used to operating in. He had just made himself, in one careless keystroke, the single most obvious suspect standing directly in the light. A cornered man does not, in my long experience across 72 years, become more careful once he understands his own situation. He becomes far more dangerous and far less predictable. Dorian understood correctly for perhaps the first time in his entire adult life that the only living witness capable of explaining the full architecture of the trap, now closing steadily around him, was locked safely away inside a facility he himself had signed the commitment order for, in his own handwriting, less than a week earlier. If I could simply be made to disappear, quietly and medically, without a single whisper of suspicion attached to it, the entire federal case building against him would instantly lose the one voice on this earth capable of unraveling it in front of a jury. 2 days later, through a contact he had cultivated across years of expensive, reckless nightlife in clubs he could no longer afford, Dorian purchased a small glass vial of potassium chloride from a man he met in an empty parking lot on the far edge of the city, beneath a single flickering street lamp on a dead-end street lined with shuttered warehouses. A compound that, injected in the correct dose into the right vein, stops a human heart cleanly within minutes and leaves almost nothing behind for a coroner to find, particularly inside a facility already documenting an elderly patient's carefully fabricated mental decline in its own official records. He planned to enter Fairhaven Rest that same night, locate my room using a hand-drawn floor plan a bribed guard had given him weeks earlier, and stage what would look, to any outside observer or medical examiner, exactly like an old man's heart finally giving out under the weight of his own paranoid delusions. A quiet, unremarkable death of the kind that happens in places like that every single week without a second glance from anyone. He had bribed that same low-level security guard weeks earlier, back when he only imagined he might need a quiet, unlogged way in, to pressure me one more time into signing something else. He never once imagined that same access would become the door he used to end my life entirely. But desperation, I have learned across a long life on this earth, does not politely ask a man's permission before it slowly reshapes exactly what he believes himself capable of doing to another human being. It simply drags him there, one small private decision at a time, until the unthinkable finally starts to feel, in the quiet of his own mind, like the only option left on the table, the only door still standing open in a hallway that has otherwise sealed itself shut around him. I have spent a great deal of my life around men who build things, and I have come to believe there is a particular kind of arithmetic that only reveals itself to a man once he is already drowning. Dorian never once stopped, in those final desperate days, to ask himself the one question that might have saved him: why an elderly man supposedly slipping into paranoid dementia had also managed, only days earlier, to sign guardianship paperwork with a hand steady enough to pass a notary's inspection without a single question raised. He was too busy counting the $50 million he did not yet have to notice that the story he had built for my daughter and the story sitting in front of a judge did not, in fact, match each other at all. Greed rarely checks its own math. It simply keeps moving forward, certain that the next number will finally be the one that fixes everything. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a man once he has decided to kill someone, and the agents who later interviewed the guard Dorian bribed described exactly that quiet passing over him in the days leading up to that night. A stillness, a distance, the look of a man who has already left the ordinary world behind and is simply waiting for his body to catch up. He told no one what he intended to do, not even the young woman he had been seeing on the side for the better part of a year, whose name would come out later in the trial as nothing more than another small, sad detail in a much larger collapse. He drove to Fairhaven alone that night in his own car, the vial resting in the cup holder beside him the entire way north, and I'm told he stopped once at a gas station off the highway to buy a cup of coffee he never drank, because his hands, for the first time in his adult life, would not stop shaking long enough to lift it to his mouth. Dorian moved down the dim, silent corridor of Fairhaven Rest just after midnight. The vial and a prepared syringe wrapped carefully inside a folded handkerchief tucked deep into his jacket pocket. His bribed contact having waved him silently through a side entrance without a single word passing between the two of them. The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and old carpet, lit only by soft fluorescent strips overhead, wrapped in the particular kind of silence that exists only in places built quietly to hold people. The rest of the world has already agreed, in some unspoken way, to forget entirely. He counted the doors as he passed them, his own breathing loud in his ears, rehearsing in his head the same calm story he intended to tell if anyone stopped him. A concerned son-in-law checking in late because visiting hours never fit his schedule, a story he had polished carefully in his own head the entire drive north. He found the brass numbers marking room 404 cold under his fingertips. He eased the door open without a sound, the hinges silent, well-oiled, as if the room itself had been waiting patiently for him. In the dim wash of light spilling in from the corridor behind him, he could just make out the shape of a body beneath a folded blanket on the narrow bed, turned toward the far wall, perfectly and completely still. He crossed the small room in 3 careful, silent steps, his heart pounding louder in his own ears than he expected, reached down and pulled back the blanket to expose an arm for the injection, and found nothing beneath it at all but 2 ordinary pillows, arranged with deliberate, almost gentle precision to hold the exact shape and weight of a sleeping man. For one disorienting second, he simply stood there, hand hovering over the empty bed, unable to make the picture in front of him match the plan in his head. Before Dorian could fully register what he was looking at, before the confusion had even finished settling across his face, the heavy steel door of the room slid shut behind him with a sound like a bank vault, sealing for the night, and a soft electronic lock engaged somewhere deep inside the frame with a decisive, final click. He spun toward it instantly, rattled the handle with both trembling hands, and found it would not give even an inch. No matter how hard he pulled, no matter how many times he slammed his open palm against the cold steel. The lights in the room snapped on at full brightness, without any warning at all. A wall-mounted television flickered to life directly across from him, the screen glowing in the sudden brightness. And there, filling that screen from edge to edge, was a face Dorian Steed had spent months convinced he had reduced entirely to a frightened, fading old man. Except this version of me was not frightened, and I was most certainly not fading in the slightest. I sat in a dark, wood-paneled office, wearing a bespoke steel-gray suit, the exact same color I had always favored, but cut now with the quiet precision of a man who had never once, in his entire life, forgotten who he truly was underneath any suit he wore. Beside me sat Dr. Alaric Penn, the director of Fairhaven Rest, and, as Dorian was about to learn in the very worst possible way, a man I had fought alongside decades earlier, back when we were young enough to think we were invincible, long before either one of us ever owned a suit worth mentioning to anyone. "Did you honestly believe," I said, my voice carrying flat and even through the television speaker, unhurried and without a single trace of the trembling he had memorized so carefully weeks earlier, "that you could bribe your way into a hospital I personally own in order to kill a man who owns the very ground it was built upon?" Fairhaven Rest had never once belonged to the investors Dorian assumed sat quietly behind it, collecting checks from a distance. It had been my facility for 11 years by then, purchased carefully and privately through a family trust, after I had watched over the years too many wealthy families use institutions exactly like it to make inconvenient elders quietly disappear from their own lives without a trace, left to fade in rooms nobody visited on holidays. Dr. Penn had not accepted Dorian's bribe out of any personal greed whatsoever. He had accepted it, every single dollar of it, and reported the entire transaction directly to me and to 2 federal agents within hours of Dorian first approaching him weeks earlier, because he was the one old friend left on this earth I trusted enough to help me build this entire trap from the ground up, brick by careful brick, without a single word of it ever leaking beyond the 2 of us. "You should have checked the deed, Dorian," Dr. Penn added quietly from beside me, his own voice calm, almost gentle, the voice of a man who had spent 40 years learning how to speak to people at the very worst moment of their lives. "Before you handed a man cash in a parking garage, you might have asked whose name was actually on the building you were bribing your way into." The screen split cleanly in 2 before Dorian's eyes. On the left, he stood frozen behind a locked steel door, with absolutely nowhere left to run. On the right sat my daughter, Isabel, seated beside 2 FBI agents and a court-appointed attorney, watching a live security feed of the exact room Dorian was currently standing inside, watching in real time, unfolding right in front of her own eyes, the man she had married raise a syringe filled with poison toward the bed of a man she had genuinely believed, until that very second, was her helpless, dying father. I did not need to see her face on that split screen to know precisely what was happening to it in that moment. She told me much later, sitting across from me at this desk, that the sound which tore out of her that night did not feel like ordinary crying at all. It felt, in her own words, like something breaking loose that had been buried carefully, quietly, under 5 entire years of patient, deliberate lies she had never once been given permission to question, all of it surfacing at once in a single unbearable second that she said she still feels sometimes, late at night, when the apartment is too quiet. Dr. Penn told me afterward that Dorian did not scream or beg or even try to explain himself once the split screen appeared in front of him. He simply stood very still, in the middle of that locked room, staring at his own reflection in the dark glass of the television between images of my daughter's face, as though some part of him had already understood, long before the agents arrived, that the version of his life he had been building for the past 5 years had just quietly ended. I am told he did not say a single word until the agents finally opened that door. Some men, when they are finally caught, reach for excuses. Others simply go silent, the way a house goes silent after the power finally cuts out for good. Dr. Penn and I had planned that room down to the smallest detail over the course of nearly a year, testing the lock twice, rehearsing the timing of the lights and the television feed with the two agents who would eventually be waiting just outside in an unmarked car down the road. What we could not plan for, and what neither of us spoke about afterward for a long while, was the sound Isabel made watching it happen live. Dr. Penn told me he had to leave the observation room for a moment himself, something he said he had not done in 30 years of working in facilities exactly like that one. He told me that catching a predator is one kind of work, but watching a daughter's entire understanding of her own life come apart in real time is another kind of work entirely, and no amount of planning prepares a person for the second kind. The steel door of room 404 did not open that night for Dorian Steed's escape. It opened for 6 federal agents who moved into the room without a moment's hesitation and had him disarmed and handcuffed against the wall before he managed to force out a single coherent word of protest. In the weeks that followed, he was formally charged with financial fraud, attempted unauthorized access to a federally monitored account, and attempted murder in the first degree. I am told the prosecutor assigned to his case did not bother offering him a plea deal worth the paper it would have been printed on, and that his own defense attorney withdrew from the case within a month, unwilling to attach his name to what the evidence so plainly showed. I did not go to sit in a courtroom that day and watch any of it unfold in person. I went home instead, to the deep quiet of my own house, and I waited on the front porch as the early morning light slowly came up over the trees, because I already knew, with complete and total certainty, that my daughter would come to me before the day was out. She arrived just after dawn, and she did not walk up my front steps that morning so much as she fell onto them, dropping to her knees on the cold stone, sobbing in a way I had not heard from her since she was a small girl, who had scraped both knees badly learning to ride a bicycle I had built for her myself piece by piece, one quiet Saturday afternoon in the garage while her mother watched from the kitchen window, laughing at both of us. "Daddy, please," she said over and over again, the words tumbling together in a rush she could barely control. "Please forgive me. I signed those papers. I let them take you away from your own home. I believed him instead of believing you. Please, please forgive me for all of it. I want you to understand something now, because I believe it is the single hardest and most important thing I have ever done in my entire life as a father. I did not pull her up into my arms that morning, no matter how badly some quiet, aching part of me wanted to. I stood over her instead, and I let her feel, fully and without softening a single word of it, the entire weight of what unconditional forgiveness, without any real accountability, would have cost her going forward for the rest of her life, the way it had already cost so many families I'd watched over the years, families who forgave too quickly and paid for it twice. Love without judgment is a bullet with a sugar coating, Isabel, I told her, my voice steady, but not unkind, not raised even once. You chose the polished man over the man who actually raised you and taught you to ride that bicycle. Now you have to carry the true cost of that choice yourself on your own 2 shoulders, so you never make it again as long as you live. She looked up at me from the stone, her face streaked and swollen, and asked the only question that seemed to matter to her in that moment. "Do you still love me?" "More than anything left in this world," I told her honestly. "That was never the question, Isabel. The question was always whether you loved yourself enough to see what was standing right in front of you. That's the part you have to go learn on your own now." She asked me, through fresh tears, how I had known from the very beginning that Dorian was capable of any of it, the fraud, the lies, the syringe he had carried down that hallway in the dark. I told her the truth, because I owed her nothing less than the truth by that point in our lives. I told her I hadn't known, not with any certainty, not until the night he raised his hand toward that empty bed. What I had known from the very first evening he called me a fossil in front of his boss was only that a man who needs to make someone else small in order to feel large is a man who will eventually run out of people willing to shrink for him, and that when he does, he goes looking for the nearest person who still will. I told her I had simply made certain, for as long as it took, that the person he found waiting for him was me and not her. I want to say something here to anyone watching this who has ever sat where my daughter sat that morning on those cold stone steps, ashamed of loving someone who turned out to be exactly what everyone else could already see. Shame is not the same thing as guilt, and too many people my age spend their final years confusing the two, either in themselves or in the children they raised. Isabel was not guilty of malice. She was guilty of trust placed in the wrong hands, which is a very different thing, and a far more human one. I told her that morning that I was not interested in punishing her for being human. I was only interested in making certain she never again mistook a man's confidence for his character. 3 months later, Isabel sent me a photograph of her very first sold painting at that small Brooklyn gallery, a modest watercolor of the harbor she had painted on a Sunday afternoon between shifts, priced at $400 and bought by a stranger who had no idea who her father was. I did not reply to that message with money or with praise dressed up as a lesson, the way I might have a year earlier. I simply wrote back, "Congratulations," and meant every letter of it. I did not write her a check that morning on those cold porch steps. I did not restore the credit cards, the apartment, or the comfortable life that Dorian's arrest had left in sudden ruins, scattered all around her feet. I gave her instead only the address of a small, struggling gallery in Brooklyn that needed an assistant, a job that paid barely enough to cover rent on a modest studio apartment with a view of nothing but a brick wall, and I told her plainly that everything else in her life, from that morning forward, every single piece of it, without exception, she was going to have to rebuild with her own 2 hands, exactly the same way I had built every last thing I ever gave her in the first place, decades earlier, out of nothing but stubbornness and time. She looked up at me from those cold stone steps like I had struck her directly across the face. In a certain sense, I suppose I had. But it was the only strike in 72 years of my life that could ever hope to teach her what 5 comfortable years of a well-told lie never once managed to. That evening I sat alone in my study, in the very same chair where I had once let a teacup slip deliberately from trembling fingers to convince a predator that I was already fading quietly into nothing at all. I poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon and watched the last strip of orange light fade slowly out over the skyline beyond my window, the same color, I noticed, that had once painted my daughter's apartment on the worst night of both our lives. I had won, completely and cleanly, without a single loose thread left dangling anywhere for Dorian Steed's future lawyers to pull it inside whatever cell he would spend the coming decades of his life confined to. And I sat there in the deep silence of a house that had been built once for a family large enough to fill every single room of it with noise and light, and I understood. In that particular way, only a man my age comes to understand anything at all in this life, that some victories cost you the very thing you fought hardest to protect in the first place. Justice had been served in full that night, down to the very last detail, with no mercy wasted on a man who had shown none himself. But it had been served in the end to an old man drinking alone in a quiet room built for people who no longer lived there, and I have learned across a long life that there is no version of triumph clean enough to fully erase that particular kind of solitude. There is only the peace of knowing you never became the man who once hurt you, and the quiet, stubborn hope that the daughter you let fall onto cold stone steps that morning will one day learn to stand back up because of that fall, and not merely in spite of it.